Hi, I'm Victoria, the host of Listen Up HomeBuyers, and I'm pleased to have with me today Jeffrey Jackson, the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Federal Insurance Directorate within the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration at FEMA. Mr. Jackson leads flood insurance operations for the National Flood Insurance Program at FEMA. And Jeff, it is a real pleasure to have you as a guest on Listen Up HomeBuyers.
It's a pleasure to be here, Victoria. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. I'd like to dive in because this is on everybody's mind. It's a headline all over the country. I'll start by saying it's August 19th, 2022, and we are going to be talking about flood insurance and flood programs. So can you kick us off with what you're working on right now? What are some of the main big top priorities within your organization?
Yeah, the first really is education and getting the word out that everyone is at risk for flood. Flood is the most common natural disaster in America. 98% of the counties in the United States flooded to some degree last year. And so where it rains, it can flood, as we like to say, and that really means it can flood anywhere. So it's important for everyone to know that they have a flood risk. It's not about if you're in a high risk flood zone on a map. And so what we're really working on is updating the way we price insurance, the way we explain it to the public so that people understand what their individual property's risk is. And that goes to the way we rate insurance policies, which changed this past year for the first time in the history of the program since its inception 50 years ago, to be based on the individual risk of your property. So it's based on what is built there, the size and the how expensive your home is. It's based on where you sit in relation to water. But as we know, with the changing climate, we're seeing more and more flooding. Houston is a prime example. We used to go by the 1% flood chance, or the 100-year flood. Houston had 3 100-year floods in a row. And so things are changing. And I think we have to all recognize that maybe we didn't think we had a flood risk before, but we certainly do. And we need to learn about that. And what we're focused on at FEMA is putting out products and talking to people in a way that they can understand how they're at risk, because we all have a risk, and then the things that they can do to mitigate that risk.
So every homeowner, and this podcast is usually directed at home buyers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but every homeowner needs to be aware of the change in their neighborhood and in their community. And can you talk to me about where does that start? Does that start with a conversation with your insurance, your home insurance person, your contact?
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about first-time buyers too, and was really delighted to learn about your podcast. Back in 2010, when I was a first-time buyer, I would have loved to have these kinds of resources available. But you do need to learn about your community, and if you're thinking about purchasing a home, learning about where that property sits, within that community, and learn about the community and what its flood risks are. And it's not just whether it's flooded in the past. I think if we could say anything, that's an important thing to say. And then to let every homeowner in America, we want to let every homeowner in America know that your homeowner's insurance does not cover flood. That is true in almost every case. And so the worst thing that can happen to a homeowner is to call your insurance agent after your house floods, thinking that it's going to be covered under your homeowner's insurance policy, and then you find out it's not. So we're really working to get the word out there, but it does begin with a call to your insurance agent to talk about getting a flood policy and to get a price on a flood policy. And as I said earlier, now that we've updated our methodology, that flood policy is not just going to be based on where you sit on a map. It's going to be based upon the individual characteristics of your home, how as the climate changes and as we look at the future, how likely in the next year your property is to flood. And so it's exciting because we're giving homeowners transparency in a way that we've never given it to them before about what their flood risk is. And, that gives you an opportunity to make an educated purchasing decision about whether to purchase a flood insurance policy.
Right. Now, should everyone have flood insurance?
We would love for everyone to have flood insurance, and not because we want to sell a lot of policies, but because we know that every home is at risk of flood. From a FEMA perspective, we go into communities after floods happen, and you can walk down the same street and you'll inevitably meet a family who had flood insurance, and you'll meet a family who did not have flood insurance.
I've read the stories.
Yeah, an inch of water can cost up to $25,000 of damage to your property and to your belongings. And so, a couple of inch flood, not to mention some of those catastrophic floods we've seen, it can be in the tens of thousands of dollars. And it's heartbreaking. We're glad to service the person who has the policy, and you see the difference side by side in these communities, the people who have flood insurance and the people who don't. And the message, tough as it is to deliver, is that if you don't have flood insurance, you do have a plan for what happens when it floods. It's to take the money that you need to rebuild your home out of your home equity, to put yourself behind on getting that 30-year mortgage paid off, or to put it on a credit card and put yourself in the position of paying high interest rates till you get that paid off, or taking a loan from the Small Business Administration, which is often available post-disaster. But you're really putting yourself behind in terms of the biggest investment that you're going to make, which is, we know for most of us, it's our home.
It's your home.
But then also, it's where your family lives, and that's your biggest personal investment. And so that's why we believe in the combination of what we call mitigation. So there are things that you can do to lower your flood risk, and if you go to FEMA.gov, you can learn about that as well as talking to your insurance agent. But to come right back around, the best thing you can do is talk to your insurance agents to learn about flood insurance and to decide if it's right for you.
I read a report in Scientific America that said that almost no one in Kentucky has flood insurance. And I know that around here, I've had clients looking at flood insurance, and it's expensive. Is FEMA helping with that? And can you talk a little bit and address that situation?
Yeah, I mean, Kentucky is particularly heartbreaking. I grew up in Middle Tennessee, and have driven through some of those communities a number of times, and it's just heartbreaking to see the devastation that has happened in those communities. And those particular communities actually, we don't have a great national average when it comes to people taking flood insurance. It's only about 4% between the policies that FEMA sells and between the private market. And it was even, I think, in those communities, 1% to 2%. And so it's, half of what's normal, and what's normal is not particularly good.
Right.
And so, FEMA is there, and is going to be there from a disaster assistance perspective. But the disaster assistance that FEMA provide, that's another important thing to talk about. It's not going to be the same as insurance. Right. Insurance is going to put you on a trajectory to recover much more quickly. And if you don't have insurance, many of those folks are going to spend years trying to recover. And on the small business side, after a disaster, 1 in every 4 small businesses never comes back. Yeah. And so, that holds at the household level too. People spend years, if not decades, trying to recover. So Kentucky's a tough situation. It also speaks, you talked about the cost of flood insurance, and it's expensive. Yeah. It's only getting more expensive because we're seeing more and more and more flooding. So FEMA, for many years, has talked about the importance of an affordability program. Yeah. And we continue to hope to work with Congress on considering that, and giving them all the information that they give, so they can consider passing affordability legislation, because we work very hard to try to convince the people who can't afford it that it's a good investment, and that they'll be glad they made it if they had a a flood loss, but so many families in America simply can't afford it, or it's a choice between groceries and between flood insurance.
Flood insurance,
That's no choice at all. You're
Right.
going to pick groceries every time. And so it's a tremendous problem in America. It's one that we're going to continue to talk about here at FEMA, and look forward to continuing the national conversation.
Yeah, I think it is cost prohibitive for some people, as you say. And I know, I'm a real estate broker in the Washington, D.C. area. And I had a client looking at a property in an area called Riverdale. And we pull up the tax map and we look at the flood report, and we see that there's, I think on this particular property, there was a letter A. It was a high risk flood area. And maybe you can address that in a second. But so anyway, the long story short of that was that the cost of the flood insurance, because this was a first time home buyer, inevitably she said, I'm not moving ahead with that. So that was a tough one. And I think, an example of what is happening, of course, all over the country. Can you talk about let's talk about buyers. When somebody is looking at a property, I know that the high risk flood areas start with letters A and V on your FEMA map. Talk a little bit about what that means and whether or not that's something that a first time home buyer should be concerned with.
Yeah, as we've moved along here, the maps certainly have their uses. And so the primary use of that is to know if you're in a mandatory purchase area. So as you said, the V zones amount to coastal high risk, and the A zones amount to riverine high risk. But you can't just look at the map and make an informed decision. The very first house I bought was in a low risk zone, but it was very close to an A zone. And so I happen to know about flood insurance because I worked for FEMA, but ended up purchasing it. But maybe I wouldn't have known, and I would have gone along thinking that I was low risk. But what we know from the National Flood Insurance Program is 40% of all of our claims come from outside the high risk area. That's an awful lot of claims. And if we had probably if we had more people buying insurance, that number potentially would be even higher. So with many people are experiencing flood loss, you can't just look at a line on a map for a couple of reasons. One is that's a snapshot in time. So whenever that map was done, that was what they thought at that time. It was the best science at that time. Two, maps have limitations because if you're, as I was in an X zone, which is a low risk zone. I was about 50 yards from an A zone. So I'm not low risk. I'm at least medium risk, if not higher. But if you just only looked at the map, it might be easy to say, oh, I'm in an X zone. I don't have any risk at all. And that's where I think, as a country and as communities have fallen down. And it's a responsibility for all of us, realtors and realtors and insurance agents play a role. We at FEMA play a role. Local floodplain managers play a role in explaining flood risk to people. And so that's why it's just so important before you consider purchasing a property. Yes, you're going to want to look at the map to understand if you have to purchase, but you really want to talk to an insurance agent to understand the level of your risk. And unfortunately, as that risk gets a little bit higher, the price is going to get a little bit higher. But even though the individual that you cited ended up not purchasing that property, that's the kind of informed buyers that we want to help encourage. By knowing what they're getting into. And I think that's so important. And gosh, I can think back to being a first-time home buyer, and it's, you're learning about all these things for the first time, and you've never done it. And, you don't know maybe much about what flood insurance is, or even about what homeowners insurance is. And you're kind of just going through this crash course, but flood, add flood risk to your check sheet when you talk to your realtor and when you talk to your insurance agent.
No, I think that is excellent advice. And your crash course, it is true, because that is kind of what the home buying experience is like. But the most important thing I think that anybody can do when purchasing a home, and certainly my job helping people buy homes, is to make sure they have all the information.
That's right.
All the information that's available. And it seems like a lot. And we can keep discussing it and going over it. But when you have that information, then you can decide what you're going to do with it. So let's back it up a bit. So I'm a home buyer. I'm looking at a property. On my checklist is going to be checking to see my where it is on the flood maps. And then reaching out to a potential insurance agent to talk about flood insurance at that point in time. If it is cost prohibitive in that moment, but I love the house and want to move forward, do you have any advice for somebody who would be in that situation?
Yeah, so much like you can buy a house that's a fixer upper and plan to tear out that kitchen and build your dream kitchen, or update the appliances. It all comes at a cost. There are things that you can do to lower your insurance premium. If you go to Floodsmart.gov, you'll see you'll both find a place to contact an insurance agent who can sell you flood insurance, and who can talk about flood insurance. But you'll also learn about mitigation. There are things that you can do. They cost money. They range from low cost to medium cost. Things like taking appliances out of your basement and moving them to an upper floor can make a difference in your insurance rates. It tends to be more for coastal properties, but elevating your home, which can be expensive, can make a difference. And then things like flood openings can make a difference too, as well. And so, there are people that your agent can get you in contact with, contractors and such, who specialize in these mitigation projects. And then your agent, the good thing about working with an agent is they can tell you what your flood insurance is going to run before your mitigation action and then after your mitigation action. So you can really figure out what that return on investment is. And it can make the difference between making a property affordable for folks and making it be something that maybe they want to take on. And that's your individual situation. Just like, when I bought my first house, it was very important to me to not spend the next year doing home
improvements,
an upgrade, home improvements. Yeah, thank you. That was important to me, but for many people who love that sort of thing and who like taking it on, they're more than happy to pick a property where there's a little bit of work to be done. And I had an uncle who, for many years, that was his specialty. That was his business. He would go buy houses and he would improve them, fix them up. And he would live there during the time, and then he would roll right into the next one. So it's a different decision for everybody. And just like the home buying decision itself, the flood piece of it is, what do you feel comfortable taking on right now? But you mentioned, Victoria, the key thing in it. I would be happy if everybody knew their risk going in, knew what was and was not covered by the insurance purchases that they made, and had a plan for what happened if they were to experience the flood loss. I think that's where we're trying to get to as a country.
Yeah. In the greater Washington, D.C. area, I go into more wet basements than dry basements, and wet variations of wet. Sometimes it's just the smell. And, if it's a cinder block foundation, you're going to have that kind of porous, kind of chalky, wet smell if it's wet outside. But I can tell you neighborhoods all in DC, like near Capitol Hill, where I've gone in and, and it's significant. And Baltimore as well, row house after row house. And, you see there's actual water pooling in the basement. And I've even worked with people who've said, what do you think of this? And I say, I think it's going to be expensive to fix. You're right here in Fells Point, or you're right here in Federal Hill, or you're right at, in Southwest Waterfront in DC. Water tables are high. You're right by water. And if it's coming up into your basement, that's not a fixer upper that personally, I would recommend moving ahead with, because it's expensive. And these are the kinds of things that I think people need to be aware of.
Be wary of conventional wisdom. Be wary of an insurance agent that tells you you don't need a flood insurance policy because you don't live in a flood zone.
Yeah.
Be wary of people who, it can be in the realtor community, but people who kind of want you to look past those things that you advise your clients to, hey, pay close attention to that. Just be wary of those kinds of influences in your home buying decision. And, if you can find, whether it's your realtor, whether it's your insurance agent or your insurance company, if you can find people who you feel really comfortable are talking about the pros and cons of any given situation, I think that's the right place to be with the biggest investment that you're going to make. But, I just say from a FEMA perspective, with regard to the climate and the changing weather conditions, we see it every day, how much things are changing. Rainfall, you mentioned, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area also. It wasn't, but a couple of weeks ago, we had, I think it was 4 or 5 inches within an hour or something like that. I unfortunately was commuting home during that time. So it was a little bit crazy. But, those kinds of things. And then the day after, you hear stories of all these properties that are flooded. And there was an animal hospital where the animals had to be evacuated because the floodwaters were rising quickly. And I would just say for everyone out there, regardless of whether you live, I mentioned Houston earlier, that problem is not isolated to Houston and Washington, D.C. It's everywhere in America. It's impacted by not just rivers and coasts, but it's impacted by rain and mudslides. And the more development we do, honestly, the more, every time in your community you see a green space paved over, the water has to go somewhere when it comes. And so it leads to increased flood risk. And so, as we all collectively figure out how we're going to adapt to this changing climate, I think we all have to up our IQ on flood risk. And so it's one of the reasons why we enjoy, being here today and doing things like this, is to talk to as many people as we possibly can about the risk of flood. And again, going into it, knowing what the risks are and knowing what the tools are to protect yourself and making the decision that's right for you and your family.
So to recap, for homeowners, what is your direct advice to someone who owns a home today? You've said buy flood insurance, number one. Or at least talk about it with an insurance agent.
Really understand what your risk is. And, as I said, if you find that agent who really will explain the pros and cons of things to you, you're in good stead there. And if you don't have an agent or someone that you're working with, you can go to Floodsmart.gov. We have a list of people who sell flood insurance. It's across many of the companies that all of your listeners do business with. So you're likely to see a familiar company name there, even if you're not familiar with that particular agent. And in terms of the advice that the agent's going to give and the quote that they're going to give you, just know that for a policy issued by the National Flood Insurance Program, we have spent thousands of hours looking at catastrophic risk models and the individual properties of a particular house, and all of the characteristics that make something more or less likely to flood. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but the higher the price you see, the more at risk you are to flood. But the most important thing I'll close with is that everybody is at risk of flood, even if your policy is on the lower end price wise. You may be low risk, but low risk properties flood every single day, and we see it here at FEMA. And so you really got to do some thinking about that investment and what you would do if you were to experience a flood loss and how you would cover that cost. And we think a flood insurance policy is a good investment.
Okay. And then for home buyers, and we have kind of drilled down on that a bit throughout the podcast here, but it's important to gather the information, to go to the website, the FEMA website, and look at the maps. But the most important thing is to make sure you gather the information, and then you go to experts like your insurance agent and find out about the costs and about the property itself before you make the purchase.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Even if you don't decide to buy it, have them quote you a flood insurance policy. I think that's an
That's great.
extremely valuable learning tool. Where it can rain, it can flood, and we're continuing to work here at FEMA to get that word out. And so, as you go educate yourself, tell a friend or a family member or church member, about what you learned, because the more we can all get the word out, the more we can increase the resilience of all of our communities and families to flood and really all natural disasters.
Okay. Thank you. Jeffrey Jackson is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Federal Insurance Directorate within the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration at FEMA. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me on Listen Up Homebuyers. I hope you come back.
Thank you. Be great to be back anytime.